Thank you all for coming. My name is Justin Sayfie, publisher of the Sayfie Review, and we're delighted to continue our series of forums on issues important to the future of the state of Florida. We had the Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit in September in Orlando, which was an invitation-only event for Florida's leaders. That was the first event that we did, and then we followed up with that by having events on water issues with Senator Negron and Speaker-designate Chris Foley last month. And today we're honored to be joined by a number of legislators who are here to talk to us about the issue that's gotten a lot of news coverage lately, the issue of medical marijuana. So please join me in welcoming Representative Gates and also Representative Edwards.
Thank you.
We are also expecting Senator Jeff Clemens to join us, but he is in a committee meeting right now, and he's on his way as soon as he finishes the committee meeting. Representative Gates, I wanted to start with you. This is the issue of you filed a bill co-sponsored by Representative Edwards and a number of other sponsors in the House to allow or permit the limited use of a certain strain of a compound found in medical marijuana plant. Can you explain to us what the bill would do and how it is that you came to end up sponsoring a bill like this?
Well, thank you, Justin. It's great to be here. And I will tell you the reason that I came to sponsor this legislation is that Representative Edwards can be annoyingly persistent when she sets her mind to something. And for more than a year, Representative Edwards has been filling my email inbox with all of the medical evidence that suggests that there is a medical application to marijuana, and that debate in this country really should be over. It's no longer a substantive debate to have. And when I finally got around to reviewing all of those things, it became clear that the easiest first step was to take marijuana that is non-euphoric, has a very low probability for abuse, and to make that marijuana available to the 125,000 children in our state who have intractable epilepsy. And I didn't know very much about intractable epilepsy when I started this process, but it is a progressive disease. These kids will have 30 seizures in one night, and they just hope that they live till the next day so they can have the worst seizure of their life again. So I never would have thought, coming from probably Florida's most conservative district in Okaloosa County, Florida, that one of my priorities would be getting pot to kids, but here we are.
And Representative Edwards, can you tell us a little about your background on this issue and why you've decided to co-sponsor this bill and why you think it's important?
Well, I'll go, and Representative Gates opened up the floodgates, so to speak, and talk about all the research that we've done really in the last 2 years. So when he talks about, the cannabis research, we go home at night and we work with our policy health interns, one of whom is here today, Matthew Cohen, and we just go on to Google Scholar and we type in things like, cannabinoids and cancer, or THC and schizophrenia, and the cornucopia of research has been fascinating and very enlightening. So I worked with Representative Gates to say, well, why can't we take the focus and do something for Florida that's very different and focus on what I would call cannabis-derived therapies? And why can't I look at the plant as someone that has a background in agriculture and agronomy and say, what are the good things in the plant that can be extracted and that can be produced in very safe and effective medicines, something I'd feel comfortable enough giving a child. And so that's where our interest began. And there was Senator Clemens. Thanks, because you're a part of the story too. Senator Clemens in 2010, when he was first elected to the Senate, had a bill that he filed in honor of a woman named Kathy Jordan, who's been living with ALS for about 28 years now. And Kathy was very inspiring to us to look at it and say, why on earth is this woman still alive? What does she attribute this medical success to? And she very freely admits she smokes 2 marijuana cigarettes each day, and she swears that this has helped her keep her ALS under control and enabled her to live and be with us as long as she is. So that forced us to look at the medicine and the research out there and recognize that we in the U.S., we are so far behind other countries in our approach to this. The University of Mississippi, they've had the ability to study this for roughly 30 years. I'm not sure if folks realize this, but the United States, they hold the patent on cannabis. And we have one research entity in this state, in this country, in Mississippi, that's allowed to do research. Do you know how they spent their time in the last 3 decades doing research? On addiction and substance abuse. So gone has been that privilege to do it from a medical standpoint and say, well, what about this could be good? If I can separate the CBD, the cannabidiol, from the THC, and look at what other countries are doing, could I not possibly derive it in an oil form and use it for something like epilepsy, for multiple sclerosis, for irritable bowel syndrome, for Crohn's? And all of the data and the research shows such promise for just that. So I think that we're heading in the right direction. I think that the bill that Chairman Gates sponsored, I think that lays out an incredible framework to get people to look at pot differently, and that's as a cannabis-derived therapy with promise for hundreds of millions of patients out there.
Senator Clements, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure,
we appreciate you being here. I wanted to follow up with you on the point that Representative Edwards just was making about the medical research, because one of the things that you hear the critics of this type of legislation say is that, there really isn't any federal FDA research out there that's conclusively established that things like this are safe and effective, to use the FDA lingo. What would be your response to someone who would make that argument?
Well, first of all, let me apologize for being late. I was busy having my bill TP'd.
We hope that's what you were doing. Clemens wants to know if anybody's got half a bag of Cheetos.
Well, look, the reason there isn't a lot of definitive federal research on this issue is because the federal government has dropped the ball for the past 30 or 40 years. This, 50s and 60s era reefer madness attitude that we had caused us to turn away from, a plant as a form of medicine and move to these synthetic drugs that often are a lot worse for our bodies. And so there's not been a really strong federal push to do the kind of research that we need. But there's reams upon reams of anecdotal and research and stories that some people even sitting in this room could tell you, but certainly people all across the state of Florida have been sharing with me for 3 or 4 years and sharing now with Representative Gates and Representative Edwards for the past year or two. You hear these stories over and over and over and over again, and not a week goes by in my office for the past 3.5 years that I haven't had someone call and tell us about these stories, about how it's helped their child, or how it's helped their mother who has end-of-life issues, or someone who's going through cancer treatments. I've got a legislative aide right now who just finished up her chemotherapy 2 weeks ago, and she's not taking any illegal substances, but I know a lot of people who've gone through the same thing who have tried to deal with this issue, and it's helped them. So while I would love to have those FDA approvals and love to have the double-blind studies and all the research that the FDA usually does on a drug, the truth of the matter is that a lot of these families just can't afford to wait. Right. And that's why the bill that's been moving through the process this year on both the House and Senate side is so important. It doesn't solve the problem for us, but it helps a lot of families who really can't afford to wait and shouldn't have to wait for an FDA study on the issue.
Well, one thing I did notice that in a recent amendment to House Bill 843 was $1 million was put in for the Jim and Esther King Biomedical Research Center to have a process by which there could be some medical research. But I also noted that that bill was only for facilities that had FDA approval to conduct that type of research. And my understanding is there aren't any facilities in Florida that have that FDA approval. Is that correct? And how would that work?
That's right, because it's pretty tough to get approval to do something when the very act of the research would be a crime in our state.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so it's a linear way of thinking. First, let's make sure that the people who are going to conduct the research won't be committing a state crime. Then let's make sure that they won't be committing a federal crime, which they wouldn't be with those federal grants of FDA approval. And then let's make sure that the state of Florida actually has some skin in the game so that research that is going to be conducted on medical applications for cannabis occurs here, so that we can then leverage that research to better health outcomes for our citizens.
And Representative Edwards, you wrote an op-ed article recently about the need to have the research be done in Florida. Specifically, I believe that you thought it should be at one of Florida's universities.
Absolutely.
Can you talk to us about why you think that's so important?
I'm a huge proponent of the University of Florida IFAS, and I think, that is the role of the land-grant university, is to engage in research and extension. So we have individuals, let's say at the College of Medicine, College of Pharmacology, College of Agriculture, you bring all those minds together and give them the plant and say, take this and make the most wonderful product out of it that I can then take to market and help as many people as possible. And then share that research through the extension process through other state universities. Every state university has a land grant. And I think if we don't maximize the potential and involve the folks at the University of Florida, then we're not utilizing that to its fullest potential. So are there other games in town? Absolutely, but to me, as a starting point, that makes the most sense.
As the University of Florida, have you heard from them, or is that something that if the law passed, would they be interested in doing that?
Well, here's the problem, Justin. I think that if Representative Edwards and I had our way with our bill, we would centralize a lot of the cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution at a place like the University of Florida, a state university where you can really ensure the integrity of the research and the product that comes out. President Manchin expressed a tremendous amount of interest in having the University of Florida be the beachhead for that research. The problem is that if he were to do that, he would jeopardize about $300 million in federal grants that come to the University of Florida. Manchin told me on one phone call, Matt, every lawyer at the University of Florida has said I cannot do this. So I'm hiring more lawyers. And they came back and said that they couldn't do this. So what that does is it proves Senator Clement's point, which is that the federal government has got this so wrong that we can't even leverage state assets that commingle with federal dollars to be able to do the right thing for our citizens. And so we'll have an alternate approach. I think it will be very close to Senator Branley's bill that's moving through the process, and we'll have to find ways to get the FDA approval for research to occur at our universities. Otherwise, it's going to have to occur in the private sector. But that creates an opportunity, Justin, for everybody watching through the simulcast or here in the room. If you think you could build a partnership to attract private sector research dollars to the state of Florida with the right strategic partners within our state, we're putting out $1 million in bait to bring you here to leverage those dollars and to get the research underway. But while the research is going on, I think every person on this stage would agree that we have to do something for our citizens now in this legislative session, because the federal government has gotten this wrong.
Senator Clemens, the Senate bill, that's Senate Bill 1030, it's the so-called Charlotte's Web bill, takes a little bit of a different regulatory approach, or a legislative approach rather, than does the House bill. For instance, it really sets up dispensaries for distribution of the Charlotte's Web strain, and sets a floor of 1 and a maximum of 4 dispensaries for the state of Florida under the Senate bill, current 1030. You hear people say that, well, that's not enough to serve the number of children that potentially would need this drug, or others that would need this strain of it. What's your sense of that?
I would agree. I don't think it's enough, but that's not a reason to not support the bill, obviously. I see what we're doing here as a framework, and while a lot of my colleagues don't want to talk about where we go after Charlotte's Web, I think, as Representative Gates put it, this is a potential to make a lot of money in the state of Florida. There's a lot of potential to make a lot of money off this and help a lot of people. And so I think whatever we do this year and in the ensuing years, we have to understand we're laying groundwork. I fully expect the constitutional amendment to pass this fall, and we're going to be right back here next year having to implement a full system of medical marijuana, and we're only going to have a very short time frame, a compressed time frame, to be able to do it. So we have to be very careful this year if we put some sort of system of dispensaries in place to understand that however we do that, it's going to have ramifications for what we do down the road. And all of us are looking at that, trying to figure out what the best model is. We look at California and see that there are problems there. But, California was the first in the door, and they had to suffer through a lot of these growing pains. There are 19 other states that have medical marijuana, and there are a lot of great examples out there about how you can deal with it properly, how you can deal with the issues that come with dispensaries, the security issues that come with farms. A lot of that I have in the bill that I filed this year that deals with it, and it hopefully creates a little bit of a framework. But I think, we wouldn't ask anybody else who has a medical condition to have to drive 4 hours to be able to get help if it's possible for us to give them help in their community. So the hope is that we can expand upon that. I would like to see us have more than 4 dispensaries.
Mm-hmm. And Representative Gates, actually let me ask Representative Edwards, House Bill 843, which you're a co-sponsor of, takes a different approach to the Charlotte's Web, where basically that bill says that it provides for affirmative defenses against criminal prosecution if certain conditions are met. So it doesn't set up a system of regulation or dispensaries or anything like that. It basically, my reading of it is, it tells prosecutors that if these facts exist with someone who is found with cannabis or medical marijuana, that is not subject to prosecution in the state of Florida. So I guess my question to you is, to me that seems a little bit inefficient from the perspective of if you have parents or families that want to provide this to their children for experiencing these seizures, is it really going to address the issue adequately to basically say, okay, well, they're going to first be arrested, and then they're going to be prosecuted, or then the prosecutor will then make a determination as to whether the criteria in House Bill 843 are being met. What would you say to that?
Well, I first have to commend the Criminal Justice Committee chairman for taking the first step and saying, how can we address the key theme we kept hearing from patients across the state, regardless of their age or their illness, was that we should not treat patients like criminals. So first and foremost, we had a lot of work to do educating law enforcement. And I'll tell you, the Sheriff's Association, for example, they've been very gracious with their open-mindedness in learning more about this and saying, our real concern is with the THC factor. With folks getting on the road, being under the influence of THC, driving, we don't think it's as effective as in medicine. They weren't convinced. This has been an ever-evolving educational process, even to get law enforcement to come to the table and say, okay, we have now heard from these patients. We cannot sit through one more committee meeting of this heartbreaking testimony and then just be the ones that say, no, we're going to fight this and block it. So I commend law enforcement for at least working with us on that. Is the defense the best way to go in getting people the help that they need? No, but we recognize I want my families who are in Colorado, these what they're calling medical marijuana refugees, to come on back home. I want them to come back to Florida, and I want them to be able to bring that Charlotte's Web oil with them and not have to stay out there any longer than they have, because I'm friends with these families on Facebook, and I see the pictures of snow, and it's like, when can we get back to Florida? And I'm like, we are trying as hard as we can, as quick as we can. And the affirmative defense was one initial approach to say, you know what, let's address the best we can in criminal justice through Chairman Gates' leadership, the defense process. Now, we already have a medical necessity defense that's not codified in statute, but what I would say, and Jeff knows this, when I first filed the bill last year with Senator Clemens, poor Kathy Jordan, this woman who's, in her late 60s, comes up here, and she's in a wheelchair. Most of you have seen, you've had a chance to meet Kathy. Manatee County Sheriff, she gets home, hasn't been home more than 2 weeks from her trip to Tallahassee, coming and educating all of us, and her house gets raided by the sheriff. Now, what sense does that make from a taxpayer standpoint? This is how I'm choosing to spend my taxpayer resources, to go bang down the door of the lady that has ALS, who's 67 years old in a wheelchair. common sense, folks.
Well-
So that's why we began saying, one, we cannot treat these folks as criminals, and until we find a way to legalize it, we have to provide a defense for it.
So let me play devil's advocate, Representative Gates. I'm glad you mentioned the medical necessity defense, because honestly I wasn't aware of it. I read the estimating conference's revenue estimate that they were required to do for the state constitutional amendment that's going to be on the ballot in November, and I read about the case of Jenks versus State, where the First District Court of Appeal basically ordered an acquittal of charges for a couple that was using medical marijuana because they were suffering from uncontrollable nausea from the AIDS treatment that they were getting. And basically the First District Court of Appeal said that they ordered the acquittal because of this medically necessary defense. So is this bill, House Bill 843 and the Senate bill, is it a solution in search of a problem? I mean, are there cases out there where people have been charged or prosecuted or convicted or sentenced, received sentences for trying to help their children get a Charlotte's Web strain of medical marijuana, or not?
There aren't people being arrested, but then there also aren't people with access. And that's the problem that the bill solves. You see, right now, there are not a whole lot of people on the planet Earth that can achieve the ratios of cannabidiol to THC that are appropriate for these highly vulnerable children. And because there aren't that many people doing it, the people that can do it would never come to Florida and hope that the Jenks decision would provide them an acquittal, because it's easier for them to go to any of these other numbers of states that Senator Clemens mentioned. And so we want Florida to be a place where folks can either cultivate this innovative technology or can license the technology so that there is sufficient access. But I do think that the criticism is appropriate regarding the clunky nature of the bill I drafted, and that's my fault. 843 requires arrest, test, and expunge.
Right.
That's the process. You're right, Justin, that's a terribly inefficient process. It would be far better to have a set of dispensaries to be able to get this product to the people who need it. And that's why I'm hoping that the House bill will start to look more like the Senate bill. But that's the beauty of the legislative process. We had a House bill that had one paradigm, a Senate bill that had another paradigm. When I was presenting the House bill in the Appropriations Committee, I got my butt kicked by a lot of these questions, and now we're able to see some of the virtue and wisdom in Senator Bradley's bill, and my hope is that our bill will start to look like that.
So I have a couple other questions about the differences between the two bills. My reading of the House bill is that it would allow patients to grow their own, but the Senate bill would not. Is my interpretation? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And we should talk briefly about why that's important. I mean,
please do. Senator Clemens?
I think one of the interesting things about the constitutional amendment question that's going to be before us in the fall is there's no specific prescription for people to be able to grow their own. Now, that doesn't mean that the Senate and the House can't come back next year and make sure that that's part of the legislation we pass, but there's nothing in there specifically that says people are able to grow their own. It's an economic issue for folks who don't have access, or maybe are more rural and don't have the ability to get to one of the dispensaries that hopefully we end up setting up. If they're able to have a few plants on their own, controlled and regulated, they can have a certain number of mature, a certain number of immature plants. This allows people to be able to take care of themselves without government, without big pharma, any of those kinds of groups. So I think that's a very important part of the bill that maybe hasn't gotten enough attention, but for those people who have been self-medicating in a way over the past decade or so because we haven't allowed them to do it, I think it's a very, very vital section of the legislation.
And see, Senator Clemens is the most libertarian liberal I know for those reasons.
Well, let me make sure I understand
Speed limit
that.
bill, or?
Let me make sure I understand that correctly, but my understanding from reading the Senate bill is that that the cultivating of medical marijuana could only be done by an approved dispensary organization. That's also my reading of the constitutional amendment, but maybe I'm not reading it correctly.
No, you're reading it correctly, and again, but the constitutional amendment doesn't say that you can't.
Prohibited.
It's just
Right.
a matter of leaving it up to the legislature to decide, and my hope is to be able to continue talking to my colleagues in the Senate and explain to them why this is important, and as long as it's done in a controlled way and in a secure way, allowing people to grow their own medicine really is a great development. I mean, if we can democratize that process and make it so that that people are able to heal themselves, maybe we put a few companies out of business, but we also make sure that a lot of people who don't have access to health care get it.
But by that logic, Senator Clemens, why wouldn't we allow people to cook up their own Sudafed or Tylenol or Vicodin?
I do not. I don't know.
Maybe in my district.
No, but okay, okay, I'm going to mediate. You both bring up good points, because the common theme we've been hearing in 4 committee hearings now in both Senate and the House is the safety. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I'm from South Florida, as is Senator Clemens, and we're just coming out of a pill mill epidemic. So we're a little bit leery when people say, well, let's just move to a dispensary model. We want to make sure that what the patient thinks they're getting is actually medical grade marijuana, that the person behind the counter writing up the recommendation, the certification for qualification for a patient recognizes, okay, you know what, you're spending the time to say, Matt's got some back problems, he's having muscle spasms, I'm going to recommend this strain of this marijuana plant, and I think it's going to help him because of that. We want people to be protected by this and not get some kind of snake oil or quack medicine. So I think that that's been a legit concern, is to say there ought to be some oversight through maybe the Department of Health of these dispensaries to make sure that patients, first and foremost, are protected and they get what they actually need to get.
Representative Gates, what conditions would, under House Bill 843, what conditions would someone be able to legally use the Charlotte's Web, the low THC, high CBD strain of medical marijuana? Is there certain medical conditions that someone will be required to have?
Not in the current version of the House bill. This is another distinction between the House product and the Senate product, where I'm actually hoping that the Senate would take the House position. The House bill simply says, if it can't get you high, if you're doing it under the supervision of a physician, there's a presumption that you ought not go to jail as a result of your conduct. And the Senate bill specifically indicates that this would be for the use of children with intractable epilepsy. Now, Representative Edwards continues to email me about 8 times a day, and I'm learning more and more about some of the embryonic research into the effect of medical marijuana on people with PTSD, or people with Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's, or brain cancer. And I think it would be unwise for the legislature, either in a decriminalization model or a dispensary model, to restrict access to non-euphoric marijuana simply to those ailments that we know about today. Because I think tomorrow we may learn a lot more, and I don't want to have to kind of continue to legislate, which by its very nature will be several steps behind the science. So I hope that we can move to a dispensary model, but that is open to people that have other ailments which may be helped by non-euphoric marijuana.
Yeah, and just for, I have the Senate bill here, and it says that it would be for people with a medical condition that produces chronic symptoms of seizures, severe and persistent medical spasms. So those are the specific conditions that are the current version of the Senate bill would require. So, Representative Gates, I'm glad I asked the question, because I've never heard it explained that way before. But basically, your view is that if it's a non-euphoric strain of the CBD with not a significant amount of THC, that you don't believe that there should be any medical condition restriction on a non-euphoric strain of medical marijuana.
Right, and I think the right question is to Representative Edwards to maybe explain what some of those other conditions are that have benefited from this type of research.
Well, I mean, it's all in here, but we began looking, what really stuck in my craw was University of Maryland. For the last 10 years, they've been asking the FDA to approve them to be able to study the effects of CBD on treating PTSD in veterans, and they've been denied for the last 10 years by the FDA. So I apologize if those sitting up here are not real keen on more big government and more FDA, because they're really doing a disservice to the patient population, and I hope you guys are watching. But with that, we're looking at, for example, we have a colleague who's also very involved in this, and as our colleague, Representative Dave Hood, and Dave does a lot of research on this, and he also is going through treatment for brain cancer. And he is one of the most well-read, most well-respected colleagues of ours, and he goes through and he looks at what other countries are doing. He goes, and I have the research here to back up this premise to say, CBD could help slow the growth of cancer cells. And we know that more research and development is needed to do just that, to affirm that. So if I know that I have a population of people here in the state that are suffering from brain cancer, for example, why does Dave Hood have to go to Duke University? Why does he have to pack up and leave to go have his treatments? Why can't he stay here at a Florida hospital with a Florida University research component tied to it? We also looked at, for example, THC. What's the big deal with THC, the stuff that causes the euphoric effects? The reason why our bill protects and safeguards that little bit of THC, as someone who's a sibling of a child that has epilepsy, I can't even tell you what my family went through 20 years ago before we even had this type of technology. The solution back in those days, and I would argue still to this day, was, if your child is having a seizure and cannot stop seizing, you call 911, the paramedics come, they strap your kid, hook them up with Valium until they stop seizing. And why? Because the Valium, your child tenses up, they can't move, they can't stop seizing. And so that little bit of THC that helps relax the muscles, gets your child to just stop, maybe fall asleep because it's such a traumatic experience, that's what the value of having that THC is there for. And having the benefit of the CBD there to prevent it from happening, period. That's what the research shows. We looked at, here's another one from the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology, using CBD as a potential anti-cancer drug and how it ties into what's already naturally occurring in our body, the endocannabinoid system. We've got plenty of research here to show the promise for treating a wide spectrum of seizure disorders. Another one that we saw, again coming out of Great Britain, multiple sclerosis. Who of us in this room does not know someone that has Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome? There's a lot of promise for research in that as well. So, it's not just limited, CBD in and of itself is not just limited to seizures. And the work that we've done here very quickly in a very short period of time indicates just that, and that's where we're trying to get people to begin looking at that. You asked Justin for us to come here and talk about what is the future of medical marijuana in Florida, and this is what I see as being the future of medical marijuana, is to say we're not comfortable with the way things are going in California. Colorado kind of scares us. Well, why wouldn't I have a cannabis corridor in this state for research and development? Why would I not want to model what other states have done? Why can't I have a Duke University research triangle that brings high-paying jobs from the research sector here to work with a already existing population of Florida families to do just that, and to say, the federal government, they've gotten it wrong for so many years. This is our chance as a state to do it right and to frame the issue properly and make sure that these patients have access to safe, effective medicine.
So how do you solve the problem, though, of the University of Florida apparently would be interested in doing this, but every lawyer they know is telling them they can't do it? I mean, ultimately, isn't it also to get that research? I don't know. I mean, maybe there are people that object to doing research. I can't imagine anyone would, but maybe they're out there. But to me, that seems like a non-offensive, non-controversial idea. But is it solely within our power to have the research done, or is it something that will only take place after the federal government changes its policies?
Well, I would challenge and say this: of the people sitting in this room, when have you ever heard cannabis explained like that? When have you ever thought about it in those terms? One person's raising their hand, a few, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure the federal government does just that. You've got, what, close to now half of the states with hodgepodge rules and regulations that don't make any sense. And not to get into partisan politics, I still like and respect my Constitution, and I would like to have some consistency and make sure that individuals that do this in this state, they're not going to have to worry about federal prosecutors coming in 2 or 3 years with an administration and going after them for, violating federal trafficking laws with respect to banking, or they're going to prosecute them for what still is under federal law an illegal substance, which now transitions back to what Chairman Gates began with, the premise for having this as a defense for those who are doing it here legally in this state.
Well, the feds will let you do research if you have FDA approval, but that FDA approval doesn't give you immunity from state prosecution. So if we clear up the state laws, I think that creates an opportunity where entities like the University of Florida could do the research that we all, I think, believe would be optimal.
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in a couple minutes. But before we do that, Senator Clemens, you made a point earlier about we don't know what's going to happen in the November ballot. We don't know what the voters of Florida are going to decide with regard to the constitutional amendment. We know they're going to make a decision one way or the other. But you alluded to the fact that the potential exists for what legislation passes this year could impact or affect or could determine or be influential on what might happen next year if the voters of Florida approve the constitutional amendment. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, what does that mean exactly? I mean, what difference would it make to what may happen next year if the constitutional amendment passes, with whether the legislature passes a bill on Charlotte's Web? How are the two related? Sure.
Well, just to be clear, I didn't say we didn't know what's going to happen this fall. The constitutional amendment's going to pass this fall, and so what we've got to do is figure out how we're going to deal with it. Okay. And so for us to kind of put off till next year talking about this subject in the legislature, I think would have been a huge mistake, and that's why the bill that they filed has been so important. It's gotten us talking about an issue that, frankly, has been largely taboo in the first 3 years that I filed legislation on the issue. And what we've seen is a lot of my conservative friends have been able to come around to the idea that this is a personal freedom issue to a certain extent, and get behind that idea. And even Senate President Gates had talked about an issue where he had a patient years ago who had issues, and they were able to help deal with those issues through use of cannabis. Now, that wasn't Charlotte's Web, that was THC and CBD cannabis, and that's one of those discussions that we're going to have here. We've been talking about low THC cannabis and the importance that it has to those folks with epilepsy, but that's obviously not what the constitutional amendment was talking about, and certainly not what 700,000 people signed petitions for, because different strains of cannabis, as Representative Edwards mentioned, have different effects, and they deal with different issues. If you're going through end-of-life pain issues, a very low THC strain of cannabis isn't going to help you deal with that. So what we've got to be able to do is help the children that we're talking about helping with this bill now, this year, because they can't wait. But we should also be prepared to have that discussion. And I'm still hopeful. I know there's only a month left in session, but I'm hopeful that we can at least have a workshop about the greater issue. It doesn't have to be necessarily a bill or a hearing on my bill per se, but I think with that looming issue on the horizon with the constitutional amendment, I think it would be important for us to be able to have a discussion about this, so that when that amendment passes this fall, that we don't come back cold and start having the discussion then, that there's a groundwork, that I'm able to discuss with my colleagues, what do you like about the dispensary system? What do you not like about it? What do you like about the farm system, or what do you not like about it? How can we encourage business in the state of Florida? Because this is a huge moneymaker in many other states. Do we want to tax it? And that's an interesting question, because a lot of states are making a heck of a lot of money off this, but we don't tax medicine in the state of Florida. So is this medicine? Are we going to deal with it that way? There are a lot of issues that really need to be discussed, and they don't have to necessarily, we don't have to do so in the sense of discussing it as a specific bill, but I think it's important that we begin having that discussion as a legislature, because the constitutional amendment puts medical cannabis into play, whether we do something this session or next session or not. I mean, it becomes law, and patients are able to start getting the medicine 9 months after the constitutional amendment passes. We'll have one shot at it. We've got to do it right. And so what Representative Gates and Representative Edwards are doing this year is so important, because if we start looking at that dispensary system, that's going to be creating a groundwork for a system that we're going to be dealing with next year. Representative Gates had talked about the non-euphoric strains of cannabis and not wanting to not limit those. But I would imagine that those of us in the legislature who are interested in also seeing the higher THC forms would want to talk about what kind of limits we should have. The constitutional amendment has none. Right. And so we've got to figure out how we're going to deal with this issue. My bill limits it to 24 specific illnesses. But I love what Representative Gates had to say about the non-euphoric strains, because that makes all kinds of sense to me. It's just sitting here and listening to it.
Well, just to back up what your political prognostication was, I have some poll data here from the Quinnipiac poll of Florida voters from November 2013. According to that poll, Florida voters support by an 82% to 16% majority allowing adults to legally use marijuana for medical use if it's prescribed by a doctor. The support was overwhelming amongst every group surveyed, 70% to 26% amongst Republicans, and 90 to 10% amongst voters 18 to 29 years old. A couple other data points from that poll. Voters were divided 48 to 46 on whether adults should be allowed to possess small amounts of marijuana for their own personal use. And so one other data point was that 48% of registered voters supported full legalization for adults, but 46% were opposed. The biggest thing that I hear most often when we talk about the amendment, and I hear it from lots of different people, is the concern, and I think it was mentioned here, is about we don't want to become California. And my interpretation of that is that it's kind of the medical marijuana it's a joke. It's perceived as a joke. It's perceived as a backdoor method for full legalization. That in reality, people will say it is medical marijuana, but in practice, it's not medical marijuana. It's recreational use. What would you say to that, Senator Clemens? Or I mean, how?
They're not entirely wrong. I mean, the truth of the matter is that people are able to see through the medical cannabis initiatives that this is not an evil drug. That it oftentimes is safer than alcohol. Most times is safer than alcohol, and yet we allow people to drink on every corner in the state of Florida. So I can't say that they're wrong, but I will disagree that the statement with the medical cannabis is a joke, because I think certainly the three of us and any of you who have had a chance to see the children that this helps, the people that this helps, it's not a joke by any stretch of the imagination. I think what it is it's an evolving attitude on the issue of cannabis and drugs in our society as a whole. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the polling data, and there's a couple really interesting pieces that you didn't talk about. The first being that if you look at the polling over the past 10 years, it's a steady climb. We're evolving consistently and constantly on this issue. The poll numbers are different every year, but they're clear in that more and more people are understanding that this is not the great evil of our society that it's been made out to be. And the other thing you didn't talk about was support amongst independents. I was actually a little surprised to see Governor Scott come out and say that he was not supportive, because what I thought he would do would say, I'm just going to follow the will of the people. But by coming out and saying he's not supportive, when 75% of independents are in favor of this issue, I think you're taking a risk when you do that. So the polling data I don't think it's changed the mind of my colleagues in the legislature. What I think it's allowed them to do is more freely speak their mind. When they see that many of their constituents are thinking just like they are, then they're able to come out and say, okay, this is something I can support. And all credit to Representative Gates and Representative Edwards, as well as Senators Bradley, Bean, and Brandis, because they were the pioneers in coming out and saying, we believe this helps people.
I want to throw out the next question, anyone who wants to answer it. In the conversation came up right before, I was talking to someone about the issue of pill mills, which in some respects can be likened to a medical marijuana, where pill mills were a medicine, were dispensing medicines that are widely accepted for the medical benefits that they provide. However, they also have addictive qualities, and they also have pernicious aspects to them if people abuse them or use them for reasons that not related to the true medical condition for which those drugs can be prescribed. The legislature in recent years has passed legislation to try to find the right balance between how do you permit this drug that people need for their treatment, whether it be for pain or for other benefits that it provides, but at the same time not permit it to be abused to the extent that it was being abused. And certainly, I'm not saying it's not being abused today, but the number of pill mills is dramatically reduced today from where it was in 2010, thanks to the good work of the legislature and others. So, my question really is to anyone who wants to answer it is: was there anything from the pill mill experience that helps us deal with whatever's going to happen on medical marijuana either this year or in coming years if the constitutional amendment passes?
Absolutely. First of all, it points out the hypocrisy in our laws where OxyContin is deemed to have medical value, but marijuana isn't. I think if you look at the addictive properties, the curative qualities, it really is absurd that that's the state of our laws right now. Secondly, we were able to learn some things in constraining pill mills that will allow us to ensure that marijuana in Florida is less likely to be abused. It certainly isn't likely to be abused if we only approve low THC marijuana, because low THC marijuana isn't any more fun than an aspirin. And so it's unlikely to be the subject of that abuse, but creating a registry is something that we did in the pill mill space that the Senate Bill 1030 actually does for people who would want to access this form of medical marijuana. That may be something, if we have to implement the constitutional amendment, that would be helpful. You talked about California. In California, they have a list of specified ailments, and then there is sort of a catch-all. And you have to have one of these things, or a doctor's got to say okay. Well, the number of people using marijuana in the enumerated ailments in California is about 3%. 97% of the marijuana users in California fit under the catch-all. So that, I think, is informative, and I think will help Florida get it right.
I want to expand on that too. I've done prescription controlled substance trafficking laws for the last 2 years. Now this year with HB 99. And what I have taken away from both of those experiences is that we are no longer fighting a war on substance abuse, it's a war on addiction. And the example with the pill mills taught us just that, because we addressed the supply side very well, and we didn't address the demand side. So what happened in my areas, and now we see it, with the proliferation now, especially in Palm Beach County, we've got young people who are overdosing on heroin. They've switched from now those pill mills readily available and that were cheap to now something that is 10 times worse and just as lethal. I think we need to put the focus on why individuals become addicted, why some are more prone to become abusers of prescription drugs or of substances. You know what we have in the room right next door to us? A bar. How ironic. How many people have had alcoholism touch someone in their family or their friend or know someone? We're not criminalizing alcoholism. We're saying, let's make it illegal. We find ways to help people who have a substance abuse problem and help get them the treatment that they need. And there are a number of ways to go about doing it, but rather than focusing just on one type of pill, one type of prescription, one type of pot, I'd rather just acknowledge that for whatever reason, some people become addicted to some things and some people don't, and I'd like to know why. And I think that's the beauty of having research and development and finally acknowledging that we need to do more into that end to figure out what the hell is making people so abused to substances in this country.
Isn't one of the other problems too in California and with the pill mills is the issue of doctors? Isn't one of the issues that there are physicians that engage in prescription writing that is not really, I don't even know what the right word for it would be, necessary. It's the doctors in California there where you basically go in and it's what happened with the pill mills here too. You go in, you pay $100, you get the prescription. The doctor basically does a bogus.
Wow, you knew just how to price that, Justin.
What's that?
You knew just how to price that.
I did. Well, I read the newspapers. But is it? I mean, how do you deal with the issue of physicians? Is that something that can be done by law? Is that something the Florida Board of Medicine needs to address? Any ideas on that?
Well, no industry has found a way in the state to eradicate all of its bad actors. We have bad lawyers, we have bad teachers, we have bad legislators, we even have bad news aggregators every once in a while. But we can, but not any in present company, of course. But we try to find a way to create an ecosystem and an environment where those bad actors are rooted out. By creating a limited licensure scheme, it's pretty easy to find someone who's a bad actor because there's a finite number of them and you can use law enforcement to trace back nefarious conduct. But we're going to introduce as a House additive to the Senate bill some specific language that requires physicians that want to be supervising physicians over medical marijuana applications to obtain special education on this issue that will allow us to identify those doctors in a more effective way on the front end. Again, limiting that potential population. So that is something you will see, you heard it here first, as a House additive to that Senate bill. And by the way, it's something that we learned by going through the pill mill experience.
Great. Well, so I have a question on that. I'm delighted that you decided to break that news here. But is that would it be a situation where they would have to go through some training? But could you actually limit the scope of physicians? Could you pre-qualify physicians who have the ability to write this type of a prescription, either under the Charlotte's Web or, I guess, if the constitutional amendment passes, under the constitutional amendment, could you restrict, could you require a physician who wants to prescribe medical marijuana to undergo certain additional training or education before they're then qualified then to write that type of prescription? I don't even know.
We can and we will, but it bumps into another question you asked. We don't want a circumstance where we say, and this was a suggestion, well, why would any doctor, other than doctors who see children with intractable epilepsy, need this supervising authority? Why would anyone other than a child neurologist? But what Representative Edwards and I don't want to do is overly constrain the future potential of these non-euphoric strains of marijuana that are not likely to be abused. So it's really threading the needle to require that training on the front end, but why would we say today that an osteopathic physician shouldn't have this opportunity if we learn tomorrow that low THC marijuana could help slow arthritis?
I agree, and that's been, one of the core issues, and the difference is, as the amendment is crafted, it's any licensed physician under Florida statute. So I'll have chiropractors, for example, just to pick them because they had their Tallahassee day about a week and a half ago, and they came to the office, and it's like, man, we have people that are suffering with chronic pain. It'd be great for business. I'd like to be able to, prescribe marijuana. And I'm like, really? I'm like, well, what training have you had? What research? Share, because obviously we're nerds up here. We're really into studies and all that. And they're like, none. And I'm like, oh gosh. I called Chairman Gates. I'm like, yeah, we need a training component. But I think in folks' mind, they're thinking, for the people who are truly ill, they're going to be seeing a guy in a white lab coat with a little stethoscope, and he's going to write you a little prescription. They're not thinking a nurse practitioner, they're not thinking a podiatrist, they're not thinking a chiropractor. We want to make sure that people practice within their respective scope and their training, and that we're not at the same time limiting the guy who has gout. If it's proven that CBD could cure gout and help you get back to work and get back on your feet, no pun intended, then why tie their hands and limit that potential use and opportunity? It's just making sure that it's done correctly, but the bottom line is, I don't think you see many physicians getting up and wholeheartedly saying, absolutely, let's do this. Because one, they can't right now, and two, they haven't had the proper research and training. And there's a stigma attached to it as well.
I get some of those calls from physicians just because I've been on the issue for 3.5 years saying they'd like to prescribe it for some folks. I think it's going to, I'm really interested to see the language, and I don't want to comment too much on it because I haven't seen it. The question is, do we want to do that same kind of thing for OxyContin? Do we want to do it for other drugs that can actually kill people? And so, you know, I understand why we would want to have that discussion. I think it's an important one to have. And I'm not sure that another state has done that. That it'd be interesting to look at it and see how that could be structured properly. But I would have to also just say there are a lot of drugs out there that kill people, and marijuana isn't one of them. So we do a lot of hand-wringing about the prescription of marijuana and how that's going to work. But I will tell you that a lot of people die in this state taking OxyContin. A lot of people die by going next door to the bar, wherever that happens to be, and having too many drinks. So in that sense, you know, I've always maintained and will continue to maintain that marijuana is a much safer drug. So I'm really interested in seeing how that language will turn out.
One final point I wanted to make, and I want to turn it over to anyone in the audience who has a question of the panel. I noted when I was preparing for this, reading the Supreme Court opinion on the ballot initiative that's going to be on the ballot in November, that one of the arguments that was made by the opponents was about the issue of there was some language, there's language in the proposed constitutional amendment that lists the debilitating diseases, but then it also has this catch-all that says, and also other conditions where the physician believes the medical use of marijuana would likely outweigh the potential health risks for a patient. And so this was the part of the amendment that was challenged. And the Supreme Court of Florida concluded in the majority opinion that in order for a physician to prescribe marijuana to treat a medical condition that wasn't listed in the constitutional amendment, the physician must make a professional determination that the condition is debilitating, because the word debilitating was used in the amendment itself, and not only in a situation where the medical benefits outweigh the risks. So I'd never really hadn't seen that publicized or widely, but I found that conclusion by the Supreme Court interesting. I was wondering, if I were a legislator, that would be an interesting piece of language in the Supreme Court decision that you could do some things with if you wanted to propose a law to expound upon that conclusion. But I wanted to turn it over. Suzanne has the mic. Is there anyone in the audience that has a question? Here, she'll bring you the mic.
Thank you. My question is for Chairman Gates. You had answered a question that was posed earlier about why the university system wouldn't move forward with research, and the answer that you gave went to their fear of losing over $300 million worth of federal aid. Now, the reason I want to speak to this issue specifically is because I am Jeremy Bufford, the founder of Medical Marijuana Tampa, the first brick and mortar educational facility specifically designed around medical marijuana. And I wanted to know when you plan to reach out to private industry. We have the educational resources and curriculum and diagnostic tools that you were talking about sharing with physicians, for example. And we're eager to have that conversation with you. When do you plan to ask?
I don't.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
There were some interesting things. All of you brought up great points, and thank you for taking this first step in this legislation. The most important thing about this discussion, as you said, Senator, is that we get it going, that we make sure this isn't a subject that is not taboo. It has revenue benefits, it has medical benefits. I mean, who can turn their back on small kids suffering, right? It's a political win-win situation. But as you said, we're here about the future. There are other ailments. You know, during the course of this discussion, I kept hearing the words non-euphoric, low THC. The fact of the matter is my father is suffering from terminal dementia, from Alzheimer's. He's paralyzed. He lays in a bed. Okay? The only time I've ever heard him talk in the last year is when he uses a high amount of THC There's different strains. There's different compounds that you can't isolate in this. There's certain ways that you can take it, whether it's a tincture or oil, or there's only certain ways you can get certain benefits by smoking it. So for anyone to sit up there and make an ethical decision to say this person's suffering is more important than this person's suffering, it doesn't hold water. So I think that the open up the future, to not shut the door, to see that less regulation is the way for this. Now, if you're worried about California, if you're worried about Colorado, if you're worried about Florida turning into them, I have a 53-page here report from the School of Public Affairs from the University of South Florida that I myself written, it'll be given a degree for, that can tell you, it provides a comparative analysis of all 4 states, Oregon, California, Colorado, and Washington, and it shows that we can take in Florida here now. You have the opportunity to take the best from all those systems and turn away the worst. You have the opportunity to learn and get it right the first time out. And I think that's the most important thing is that we get it right the first time out, because we're not going to have a second chance at this. We all don't want Florida to turn into California. All of us who are pro for this, and even those who are con for this. And the most important thing is that there is the research, that you do take the time to educate yourself, that you do have academics who are on this. And I'm willing to provide this to all of you so that you can see, hey, there's good things in this state, there's good things in this state, but let's make the best system for Florida possible. And the best system would be one that's as least restrictive and provides patients the medicine they need to end their suffering.
Thank you.
Let me just say, I mean, I agree with I agree with what you just said. Obviously, I've been filing a bill for full medical marijuana in the state of Florida now for 4 straight years. But we live in a system that frankly has kind of not looked at this issue at all, and so and for many good reasons, many bad reasons. And while I agree with you that that we need to look to the future and have a system that helps anybody who needs the help, I will tell you that if that bill were brought forward in the legislature this year, it would fail. And
It is in the legislature. Representative Bullard and Representative Bracy's bill.
are you talking about recreational use?
Well, that one, but I mean, that one opens up, you know what I mean?
That's a recreational use bill. The full medical marijuana bill is actually my bill in the Senate. And so I have, thank you. But having said that, it's not going to pass the legislature this year. I'd love for it to. President Gates is in the room. I love you, sir. You're fantastic. But he's just, he's upset I called him out. But it's good that he's here today. The President of the Senate is sitting in a room where we're having a forum on medical marijuana. That's fantastic, and it has not happened ever before. And so, you know, sometimes the perfect just doesn't come the first time around. And you've got to find a way to get to a place where you can help the maximum amount of people in the time that you have. We have a constitutional amendment that's coming forward this fall. We'll all be able to go out and vote on the issue. If we're not going to be able to have full medical cannabis this year, the bill that Representative Gates and Representative Edwards and Senator Bradley have put forward at least helps people. And keep pushing, because that's what we expect you as citizens to do. Keep pushing us. But don't necessarily be opposed to what it is they're trying to accomplish this year, because if we're not able to move a full medical cannabis bill through the legislature this year, please let's at least try to get help to the kids who need it.
And we're 134 years after the end of Prohibition, and yet every year we still deal with bills in the legislature that regulate alcohol in a different way. So I would reject the premise of the question that we've got only one chance to do this right. We have really, you know, eternity to get it right and to fix things and to tailor them and make sure that they're done in a way that's effective for our citizens, but also doesn't encourage aberrant behavior. And so I suspect that we are on a cautious walk forward. Mm-hmm. And this is the first step. Now, you know, it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I do believe that we can successfully end the debate about whether or not there is any medical value to cannabis. I mean, look what we have here today. Jeff Clements, one of my dearest friends in the legislature, is probably the most liberal member of the Florida Senate. If I'm not the most conservative member of the Florida House, I don't know who is, and Representative Edwards is kind of right down the middle on everything, and yet here we are together able to work on something. Mm-hmm. That's one of the great differences between Tallahassee and Washington, but I hope that the benefit that we make and the momentum that we get this year will not end when the year has concluded, but will be something that we can build on in a bipartisan way to open our eyes up to medical research as it presents itself.
Yeah, and I think, I'll tell you this, and in all sincerity, I know it's very easy. We read the stories in the media, and I read the criticisms, and rightfully so, of our effort in the bill, and it's been an ever-evolving process just here in the last few months. The last thing that I want to do is give any patient or any parent false hope. And that's why substantiating the need for medical marijuana has been so crucial. How on earth would I feel as a physician to just blindly make a recommendation with nothing to hang my hat on, or without being able to say I need to be able to learn more? And I think that the work that we've done just in this session alone in the last few months has brought that conversation leaps and bounds beyond where we ever thought we were going to go with this. So, I mean, look at it this way, we get so many, you've been receiving letters and emails, the visits from families that deal with a number of different illnesses, and these people are reaching out to us, and usually they're at a point, they're in desperation. And that just makes our resolve that much further to do something and do it quick, regardless of whatever happens. But the political motivations here, at that point, yes, you have the full spectrum of political views in this room. But we all agree that we have to do something, but we have to do it the right way. And what I began looking at was in states like California, where it has been legal for so many years, are fewer people dying of cancer? Is the rate of illness low because they have that available to them? Those are things that are important to me as a policymaker, first and foremost. I mean, we're talking about health policy decisions. So I think that needs to be first and foremost the focus of our debate, because what we're doing in all these different vehicles in the conversation, I would hope that the lobbyists here get my message. Stop talking about the profit motive and how your businesses and your clients can benefit, and start talking about the patients who are going to benefit from it. Thank you.
Wait, I want to try to get as many people in. We only have just a few minutes left, so what I'm going to ask everyone to do is limit your statement to a question only, and then we're going to do three questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. So you ask your.
I was going to apologize because I have an actual question.
Okay, no need to apologize.
Yeah.
So after you ask your
Yeah, okay.
question, Suzanne, go to the next person. We'll ask 3 questions. We'll get them to answer, and then we'll wrap
Okay, my name is Kerry. I'm a large-scale greenhouse grower. Some of you know me. We grow food and ornamentals. And my question is about the structure of regulation and how vertically integrated are you going to require or want this whole process to be? I mean, I have a tissue culture lab and a greenhouse, but I don't know anything about retail dispensaries or anything like that. And I know that there's different models. There's California that's separated, the Colorado that's integrated. Do you guys have any sense of the direction you're going to go? And do you have any sense of the time frame before you have some sort of regulatory framework?
Great, thank you. Can we hold off on answering? I just want to get 2 more questions in.
As long as you remember them.
I remember them. I made a note.
My question is, you had mentioned that it would be ideal for patients to have plants in their house. And I've been studying Charlotte's Web, and I was wondering, can these patients extract the oil themselves, or is their only option, if they're growing it, to smoke it, which is prohibited in the bill?
Okay, thank you. And we'll get one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my question is, since we're talking about healthcare, I'd like to know how many physicians have been advocating for these bills. And I know for either bill, if a physician would actually be, when you say prescribing, I know in the amendment that it isn't prescribed, it's recommended. And I think a lot of people that I talk to in the public are not aware that there's not an actual prescription, but I heard everyone using the term prescription up there. So I just wanted to clarify that. But also how many physicians are actually advocating for this as opposed to just the general population. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So the first question was on what's the structure of the regulation going to be? Will it be integrated vertically or horizontally? There's different models out there. What will the Florida model be? And it sounds like that's a question more directed towards what happens if the amendment passes. Although I guess it could apply to,
No, the bill.
apply to.
You have to be entirely vertically integrated is the answer to the question. And so someone like you who's in the growing space, but you're not into the manufacturing and distribution space, you have to find strategic partners, create a single entity that will be the licensee, because that is a way to maintain the most control over the distribution and cultivation process at the early stage.
Just briefly, my bill, which isn't getting heard, does not the opposite, but it's an amalgam of both. There is a vertically integrated process that allows you to act as both a dispensary and as a grower, and also a process that allows you to separate the two as well.
But that, just for clarity, Representative Gates, that's under Senate Bill 1030, what you described, the vertical integration. It's not currently in the House bill right now.
But I've broken the great news to you, Justin, that we are migrating to the Senate.
Let's do it. Okay. All right. And then that was question number one. Question number two was, do patients have the ability, if they grow it in their home under Charlotte's Web, can they extract the CBD without the THC? Can they even do it? Is that even possible?
Once the plants magically appear in this state, we're going to get them here some way, shape, or form. But yes, we would envision that you would be able to do just that, and that would give you the ability to get a hold of these low THC strains, if you want to call it that, and be able to produce your own tincture. Keep in mind, what we've been talking about is something that's administered in oil form, either orally, under the tongue, or in a feeding tube. But we certainly don't want to restrict access. In Chairman Gates's part of the world, he's way up there in the panhandle. I would certainly never want to close the doors on the families in his area and say, you've got to travel all the way to Tampa or Orlando, when they could have the plan, they can do it right there safely in their own home.
And the third question was, how many physicians are advocating for this? And the question, the use of the term prescription, which I may have used that term incorrectly. So let's
it's not in the bill.
Let's clarify that, what the recommended versus prescribed in the bills, because I was a little bit.
My bill says prescription, but I'm not wedded to that term. I will tell you that as an organization, FMA is still evolving on this issue, as is the American Medical Association. So as an organization, we're still waiting really for a hard and fast opinion, although what they've been telling me is they'd like to see more research. Of course, it's a chicken and egg situation. Individual doctors I speak to all the time, and I haven't talked to every doctor in the state of Florida, but I have yet to talk to one who thinks it's an absolutely terrible idea. There are different levels of the doctors that I talk to. Some who think they've already recommended to their patients that they don't want to recommend anything illegal, but if they want to try to deal with this issue in a certain way, they certainly wouldn't oppose them going out and dealing with it in that way. And then there are others who are a little more concerned about how you would go about it. I would say that it runs the spectrum, just like it does through the people in this room. As a whole, doctors I think like to have a little bit more research behind the idea, but also our understanding that some families can't wait for that research to take place. So that's been my experience in the 3.5 years I've been dealing with the issue, is that doctors as a general rule are receptive but cautious.
I think the greatest example of that for us in terms of the evolution of this and the educational process was one of our colleagues, Representative Pigman, who's a physician. He's an Army doctor, right? He deals with emergency room patients, and he's from a relatively conservative area in the heartland. He's from Highlands County. And when I first began talking about this, he's like, no, I'm not going to advocate for that. I have no interest in it. And then lo and behold, in the last year, what a change, because he's taken the time to learn more and to do the research on his end. And he came to our presentation in, was it Justice Appropriations? And I got nervous when I saw him. It's like, oh my God, what is Kerry Pigman doing here? He's going to say this is an awful, terrible bill. And lo and behold, it was like a gift from God. He comes, he opens up his literature, and the most eloquent speech I've ever heard given in support of it, and because he had taken the time. And I think that the problem with most of the physicians is the stigma that's attached to talking about this openly, and they're afraid that they might lose patients. I mean, who wants to be known as the doctor that prescribes, pot for tots? It's something that still is very controversial, even within the medical community. But I think having these types of very open public conversations, getting the Florida Medical Association to change their position from opposed to at least neutral on our bill, I think sends a very good message to the medical community that, this is a very serious and worthwhile dialogue, and every physician should take the time, if they're not going to, I'm not going to use the word prescribe, to make the recommendation, at least knowing what's coming down the road, they ought to take the time to become more informed and get these continuing credit education hours and make good use of it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Senator Clemens, Representative Edwards, Representative Gates, for taking time to help enlighten us on this very important issue and participating in the forum. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much.